Well, I should have known better. I thought we'd get through verse 11 today in Acts 15, but you know how I am. We'll get through in principle through verse 5, but really what today is going to be about is circumcision. And I know that sounds like an awkward subject to speak on, except that it's the most important thing that's happening in this passage. And for me to neglect that would be to neglect what the text is saying and communicating. I think I can talk about this in a way that won't be too awkward and too irrelevant for the women here in the congregation. But why is this important? Well, let's remind ourselves of what was going on in the book of Acts. If you remember, Acts 1 through 14 have essentially been this work of God in the church, and both birthing it at Pentecost in Acts 2 to the spread of the gospel to the Jewish people, and then further on to even the Gentiles. Acts 13 through 14, we have what is called the first missionary journey. And in that first missionary journey of Paul and Barnabas, they went throughout what's called now Turkey. And as they did so, they increasingly were exposed to the Gentile community and increasingly seeing God working through this group of non-Israelites. And we'll talk about all that and what that means in just a second. Acts 15, then, it represents a significant turning point in the book of Acts. Might even argue in terms of the unfolding of the history of the world. I will argue this, that had the circumcision question here not been answered and responded to appropriately, we would not have had Western civilization unfold as it did, which is to say we are a product here in America of Western civilization unfolding as it did, going all the way back to the Romans, embracing Christianity. And the reason they did so was because of what's happening here in the book of Acts, and maybe even with Acts 15 being this climax of what God was doing amongst the Gentile people. And most of the world is Gentile. So the circumcision question is important enough that I think it warrants spending some time. Now, we do have to go back a little bit to build some context. The story of the Bible is that God intended for humanity to flourish and form culture and civilizations and nations. But rather than do that God's way, humanity rebelled against him, both individually, and we see that in Genesis 3 with Adam and Eve, but also collectively. In Genesis 10:32, you have the nations rebelling against God. And again, this is going to be, I hope, an interesting study and somewhat in-depth study, but at the end of it, I think one that you will see that is necessary. As the nations go out in Genesis 10:32 from the flood and from Noah and the people of Noah, Genesis 10:32 says, "These are the clans of the sons of Noah according to their genealogies in their nations, and from these the nations spread abroad on the earth after the flood." But what happens in Genesis 11 is that the people, rather than dispersing and creating culture, civilization, nations, verse 1 of 11 says, "Now the whole earth had one language and the same words. And as people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, 'Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly.' And they had made brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. And they said, 'Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens. And let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth.'" In other words, they got together, humanity got together, and it said collectively, we can replace God. We can be the ones whose names are glorious over the face of the whole earth. So that speaks not only of our individual nature as human beings, each one of us is being sinful, as we see in Genesis 3, but we see the human compulsion of nations and peoples to do what? make a name for themselves, make themselves great. How many empires and civilizations have had as their mantra, we are going to be the nation of all nations. We will make a name for ourselves. Our empire, our country will last for 1,000 years or whatever. I mean, how many? Like all of them. And it's ingrained in us that we are all this rebellious sinner, both when we are individuals and when we are collected together. So part of God's redemptive plan was to use an individual, Abraham, to bring forth a nation and a people that would bless all the families of the world. This is what happened. So Genesis 11 is people collect together, and they're going to rebel and sin against God, and so God disperses them. He confuses their language. And then the very next chapter, God chooses one man, Abram. He says to him, I will bless you. I'll make of you a great nation. I'll bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So individually we're sinners. Collectively we get together and we're going to collectively shake our fists at God. And so God's redemptive plan is to take one person, bless him, and say, in you, a nation will come that will bless the world. So in order for the nations to be redeemed, God is going to create a nation through Abraham. That's called the Abrahamic covenant. And it's fundamental to understanding not only the unfolding of the Bible's history, but the unfolding of human history. Like you cannot make sense of our current political climate, geopolitics, any of that without understanding this. I mean, you cannot understand many nations of the world, especially the Christian, Jewish, and Muslim nations, without understanding this. So how relevant is what you're reading this morning? Extraordinarily relevant if you have eyes and ears, and if you read or watch the news at all. The book of Acts and the spread of the gospel doesn't happen apart from this promise that occurred in the context of Jesus and the apostles. The book of Acts happened 2,000 years ago. Genesis 12 happened 2,000 years before that. So we're talking about things that happened 4,000 years ago. The state of the world today is as it is because God made a promise to Abraham that in him all the nations, or all the families of the world, would be blessed. Now, in Acts 10, we see that the good news that God saves people, it goes not just to the Jewish people, but to the Gentiles. That is non-Jewish people. Most of us here are Gentiles. And they have their own, version of Pentecost. They have their own version of tongues and miracles and all these things happening that we saw in Acts 2. But Acts 15 is what cements the inclusion of Gentiles to the blessings of God as prophesied and promised to Abraham in Genesis 12. And it cements it, it crystallizes it, because what happens in Acts 15 is the very essence of salvation and grace and faith are challenged when it comes to those non-Jews. And the question is one of consistency between Jew and Gentile, Old Testament and New Testament. Is there continuity between the faith of Abraham and Moses and David and the faith of Cornelius and Spurgeon and Yuri Huang and you? Is there continuity between what we read in Genesis 12 and the life you're living right now in terms of faith in God's program? So we left off with Paul, again, having made this round trip through what is now the country of Turkey, sharing the gospel to Jews and Gentiles. Churches have been planted, disciples have been made, the saints have been encouraged, and he's returned back to his home base of Antioch, and he's gathered the church together. He's giving a missions report. They're having potluck, and Paul's at the mic. These are anachronisms, right? There's no mic. They probably had potlucks, but, there's no podium, with the sound system. But he's giving a missions report, as we've so often heard here from our own missionaries. And he's saying the gospel, God's salvation has come to both Jew and Gentile. He's reporting all that the Lord has done. He's excited and enthusiastic. And at the very same time, what happens is this. But some men came down, this is Acts 15, from Judea, and were teaching the brothers, unless you are circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved. And after Paul and Barnabas had no small dissension and debate with them, Paul and Barnabas and some of the others were appointed to go up to Jerusalem to the apostles and the elders about this question. So being sent on their way by the church, they passed through both Phoenicia and Samaria. So Antioch is in the north, and I'll bring up the map next time, but Antioch is north of Jerusalem, and if you go south, you go through Phoenicia and Samaria to get to Jerusalem, and they're describing in detail the conversion of the Gentiles and brought great joy to all the brothers. When they came to Jerusalem, they were welcomed by the church and the apostles and the elders, and they declared all that God had done with them. But some believers who belonged to the party of the Pharisees rose up and said, "It is necessary to circumcise them and to order them to keep the law of Moses." So the issue of circumcision is bookending that section. And to understand why this is so significant, you need to understand circumcision. Now, not in terms of the surgery or to how to perform one, but the context of it spiritually. So I'm going to try and talk about this as delicately as possible and not make it awkward, I hope. But let's just start off. Circumcision is a surgery performed on the male reproductive organs that removes skin but does not harm function, okay? That's about as inoffensive as I can probably state that. If you're under 18, you ask your parents about more, all right? If you're over 18 and you don't know, ask your parents. But, okay, so it's a surgery performed on the male reproductive organ that removes skin but does not affect function. And that's as nondescript as I'm going to say that. It doesn't necessarily matter the details of that. Now, God commanded Abraham to perform this surgery on every male that would be born to him and their male children as an evidence of this covenant that God was making with them. This happens in Genesis 17. So Genesis 12, God points to Abraham and says, you are my appointed man. I will bless you, and I will make your name great, and I will bless the families of the world through you. This is reiterated in Genesis 15, and the promise is actually ratified in blood. I'll talk about that in just a moment. And then in Acts 17, God gives him this sign of circumcision. Genesis 17, 9 through 10, God said to Abraham, "As for you, you shall keep my covenant, you and your offspring after you throughout their generations. This is my covenant which you shall keep between me and you and your offspring after you. Every male among you shall be circumcised." Verse 12 adds that this happens when the child is 8 days old, and every male born in your house. And then he says, "So shall," this is the end of verse 13, "so shall my covenant be in your flesh, an everlasting covenant. Any uncircumcised male who is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin shall be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant." This is such an important deal to Jewish people that for you and I, what percentage of your life do you think about circumcision? Now, if you're not a pastor, it's like 0.00001% do you think about this. But for a Jewish person, they thought about it a lot. And we have to kind of enter into that mindset to see why they would even think to associate grace and faith and Jesus and the incarnation with circumcision. Why would they put those things together? And it's because of this. It's because it's written in their law. And it's so hard for them to shake that they would dare to try and merge the ideas of Christianity, the new covenant in Christ, and circumcision. The entire book of Galatians practically dedicated. So you have an entire epistle of the New Testament devoted to this issue. We can't ignore it. We can't just like, oh, that's awkward to talk about it. Let's do a private Bible study. No, it's here in the text as a major, almost climactic point in the book of Acts. We have to talk about it. Why circumcision as a sign of this covenant? Frankly, God doesn't give any explicit explanation of why, but we've discussed on a few occasions, this is maybe a little bit of reading between the lines, and I always hesitate, very much so, because we want to understand the text in its context. We want to go through each passage verse by verse and make sure everything is fitting with all the rest of the Bible. We take everything seriously and literally. I think these are very valid observations and connections because he says it's a sign here. It's a sign. A sign points to something. It is being used as a picture of something. So here are a few. This is not just, Pastor Yuri thinks this, but what theologians and pastors have said for 2,000 years of church history. These are observations they have made about what circumcision was intended to represent. Firstly, it's a sign for men. It's very male specific. And I think there's a reminder that it was Adam, the first man, who brought sin into the world. That it was through man that the creation was cursed, that death was brought into this world, and that rift, that separation between God was made. Yes, Eve was deceived first, but the one who receives the ultimate responsibility is Adam, who was created first, who was made along with Eve, made in the image of God, but he bore a particular burden to keep the commandments, to honor the Lord, and he blew it. And so for all the men to have this sign upon them, I think, firstly, is a reminder of the failure of man. Secondly, it has to do with the reproductive organ. It's a reminder that every person born into the world then also inherits the sin and corruption. That this is a reminder that sin has been passed on to every generation since Adam. And just look at the world. Yeah, that's true. That we are, all of us, born of a man's seed and inherit that same flaw. And the consequence for the sin is death. Both of these ideas are wrapped up in Paul's words to the Romans in Romans chapter 5, verse 12. Therefore, just as sin came into the world through one man, and death through sin, and so death spread to all men because all sinned. Romans 5:12. The notion is here that it is almost like a genetic thing that is passed on. Now, it's a spiritual thing. It's not in your DNA per se that you are a sinner, but it is being passed on in the same way that the DNA of parents is passed on. Because it's a sign, thirdly, that involves surgery, it's a reminder that blood and sacrifice is required from God in order to be right with God. It's an interesting story in Exodus 4:24. I preached about it when we were in Hebrews, actually. In Exodus 4:24, a very peculiar incident. Moses has just received the call to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. On the way, he gets stricken. He's going to die. And his wife realizes it's because his kids have not been circumcised. And so there's an emergency circumcision that happens there, and he calls him a bride, or she calls him a bridegroom of blood. What's going on there? It's kind of an interesting story, but the idea is, how is the one who is being the figurehead of the covenant, rescuing the people of Israel from the Egyptians, not show that he believes in the covenant enough to circumcise his own kids? So it's a failure on his part. It demonstrates something about his own heart and attitude. How can you have not done this sacrifice? And just an interesting comment that Zipporah says, you're bridegroom of blood. Blood needed to be shed as far as the covenant was concerned. So it's a reminder of that. Fourthly, because it's a sign that involves the removal of flesh, it's a reminder that those who are God's people ought to live separate and distinct from the world. Now, the word flesh in the Bible is often used to mean living according to your own corrupt desires and temptations. To live fleshly is to indulge yourself, to go along with all of the world's delights and pleasures. So discarding the flesh of circumcision, it represents casting off those worldly and fleshly pursuits and being dedicated to God. It's very interesting also that in those days, of course, you had a lot of weird cults, and oftentimes the sexual activity was involved in that. If a person was a Jew, it would be very clear that they were a Jew if you entered into one of these places. And so it was a very clear way to make a distinction between the Israelite and the pagans around them. And they could not indulge in these like fleshly activities because it'd be obvious that they were people of Abraham. Same with intermarrying foreign wives. It'd be very clear to the wife, like, hold on, you're a Jew, aren't you? And it's meant to be a deterrent for the Jewish person to not engage in those kinds of activities. Lastly, the word covenant in Hebrew is barit. And it comes from the Hebrew verb bara. Bara means to cut. Covenants were literally cut things. And it's because in those days, when you made a covenant or promise with someone, you would cut an animal in half. And it was represented what would happen if you broke the deal. So if you and I were going to make a deal, we kill an animal, cut it in half, and say, if you don't keep up your end of the deal, may this happen to you. And if I don't keep up my end of the deal, may this happen to me. So you cut a covenant. Covenant is literally a cut thing. We probably get the phrase cut a deal from that same idea. Why do you cut a deal? It's likely it comes from this idea of cutting a covenant. Circumcision is a reminder that there is a promise being made between God and man. Specifically, the promise of God to Abraham to bless him and bless the families of the world through him. And you as a Jew were part of that promise, and it was something evidenced in your own body. So circumcision was a big deal. It's this picture of both God's redeeming work in and through the Israelites, but also an identification of every Jew as God's people. The consequence for not being circumcised, of course, ironically, we just read in Genesis 17:14, is that you would be cut off from God, right? There's a play on words that's happening there. Oh, you don't want to be circumcised? Then you're going to be cut off from the very presence of God. Now, here's the problem in Acts 15. They're committing the same mistake as the Israelites made throughout all of their history. They had faith in their circumcision rather than faith in God. Now, it should be immediately obvious that anything you do at 8 days old is happening to you, for one thing. But for another thing, you cannot possibly credit anything a baby does at 8 days old as something of an accomplishment that you can rest on. Right? You think it's kind of sad if someone's living in their high school days and talking about all their high school achievements when they're 40 or 50, as if this is some meaningful thing that defines them, and they live in the past that way. Imagine taking something you did at 8 days old and being like, whoa, that was so great that I did that at eight days old. Like, there's nothing you did at 8 days old that's like commendatory, that you need to get rewarded or anything for. So it should be obvious to the Jewish person, like something you did at 8 days old, that's not commending you to God. That's not anything you did. It's something that happened to you. How could you rest on that? Right? To make you right before God. Circumcision was a sign of the covenant, but it wasn't the substance or the reality of the covenant. Now, by the time of Moses, so Abraham, say 2000 BC, Moses, Exodus, like 15 to 1400 BC, so that's 500 years, almost 600 years gap between Abraham and Moses. A large portion of that is filled with this time in Egypt, where at first they were welcomed and then they became enslaved. They flourished there, if you remember the story of Exodus. So Moses, after rescuing or being God's instrument of salvation to the Israelites, they wander in the wilderness. They're on the cusp of entering into the promised land, and Deuteronomy is written. Literally means second law. Deuteros means two. Nomia means a law. So the second law he gives to them, it's a reiteration of Exodus and Leviticus and so on. And he says this as he speaks to a whole other generation of Israelites on the edge of the promised land. Deuteronomy 10:16, God through Moses says, and you can read the whole section there, he says, circumcise therefore the foreskin of your heart and be no longer stubborn. Is it about a physical act? Clearly, Moses already knows, and the Lord, of course, already knows that the issues that are going on with Israel's disobedience, and they've shown much disobedience even in their wandering, is not a matter of something happened when the little boys were 8 days old. It's something of a matter of their heart that happens every day, men and women and children. It's a stubbornness, it's a stiff-neckedness, it's a rebelliousness towards God. In other words, what matters to God isn't their, physiological condition, but their heart condition. What mattered was their faith in what circumcision represented, not necessarily the fact that they were supposed to be, yes, as a requirement. But it being a requirement didn't make it the substance. It wasn't a substitute for real faith. And in that regard, a Jew could be a Jew physically, but not spiritually, as Paul implies in Romans 9:6. In fact, God prophesied that Israel nationally would, for nearly all of its history, be a nation circumcised in the flesh, but uncircumcised in the heart. In Deuteronomy, a very large section of the end of it is regarding blessings and cursings. In Deuteronomy 27, 28, 29, 30, and most of it's about the cursings. And most of it is not even the threat of a curse or a consequence for their disobedience. Most of it is like a prophecy of these things are going to happen to you because you are going to disobey. You are going to rebel. But Deuteronomy 30 has this promise that at some time, after all of their failings, after all of their wanderings, after all of their disobedience, God is going to perform heart surgery on national Israel to finally make for himself a people who will love him with all their heart and all their soul. And so Deuteronomy 30, verse 6, is a promise. After all this comes to pass, that's how Deuteronomy 30 starts. When all these things come upon you, the blessing and the curse, verse 6, Yahweh your God will circumcise your heart and the heart of your offspring so that you will love Yahweh your God with all your heart and with all your soul, that you may live. Why should this matter to any of us here, especially the women who maybe feel a little left out of the conversation? Because the point isn't about male body parts. It's a picture of the failure of sinful humanity to please God unless God himself does heart surgery. We all care about this because it's a picture of all of our failure, all of our rebelliousness, all of our disobedience. And Israel was this microcosm of humanity that none of us can please God in our obedience. And so we need this new promise. The very language of what we call the new covenant. So you have the Abrahamic covenant, right? That's this promise. You know what, Abraham, I'm choosing you to bless the whole world through you. It's unconditional. I will not revoke it. Then he gives a Mosaic covenant, which is what we're talking about here. You know, you're going to enter the land and you need to keep these promises, keep these commandments and laws, and you will thrive and you'll live in this land. But you know what? You're not going to. So here's what's going to happen. So it's sort of a command, it's sort of a prophecy all mixed together. And the whole point of it is how unworthy and undeserving they are of God's favor. And so God promises, you know, I love you though. I said I was going to do this. I told Abraham, I'm going to bless all the nations through you, but you keep screwing it up. You cannot be this holy nation. You cannot be an example to the world. How are you going to bless anybody? You can't bless yourself. You can't bless me. So I will do something. I'm going to change your heart. I'm going to circumcise your heart. And this is what's called the new covenant. Jeremiah 31, verse 33, very famously, this new covenant is worded. It's very similar language to what we just read in Deuteronomy 30, verse 6. But Jeremiah 31, verse 33, God promises, behold, the days are coming, declares Yahweh, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah, not like the covenant that I made with their fathers on the day when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt. My covenant that they broke, though I was their husband, declares Yahweh. So he's talking there, direct reference to the events of Deuteronomy. So Jeremiah is referencing, this new covenant I'm making is not like that one that you couldn't keep, that you kept breaking. For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares Yahweh. I will put my law within them, and I'll write it on their hearts, and I'll be their God, and they shall be my people. It's the very same idea as Deuteronomy 30. In other words, the circumcision that God is going to make on our hearts is the same as this heart surgery, this heart transplant that God is talking about in Jeremiah 31 and also Ezekiel 36, and so on. Because we cannot please or honor God on our own. The promise of this circumcised heart and the new covenant for Israel are one and the same. And yet that promise is yet future for national Israel. It hasn't happened yet. Jeremiah 31, Deuteronomy 30, it hasn't happened yet to Israel. But what God has done is to bring Gentiles into that covenant. Some of it is kind of to provoke Israel. This is what Paul talks about in Romans 11, verse 11. Romans 11, Paul says, so I ask, did they, that is the Jewish people, Israel, did they stumble in order that they might fall? By no means. Rather, through their trespass, their disobedience to the covenant, their crucifying of the Son of God, salvation has come to the Gentiles so as to make Israel jealous. It's an interesting thought there, but it's almost like the Gentiles have been given the gift that was originally intended for Israel, to make Israel want that gift. Now, one day, I believe, and our church teaches that will happen, that they will receive the gift originally intended to them. But here's how God intended to fulfill Genesis 12 and that promise to Abraham. In you, all the families of the world will be blessed, is in Israel's rejection of their Messiah, the Messiah has now been presented and offered to the rest of the world. And that changed everything. That changed the course of human history. It is the purpose of human history. It's not that it changed the course as if it was destined for this way and now it's going this way. It's just that was always the plan of God. God has fulfilled his promise to Abraham of blessing the families and nations of the world by offering the same universal hope to both Jew and Gentile. God can circumcise any sinful heart, not just the Jewish sinful heart. And that is to say, it isn't about circumcision. It is about our sinfulness and brokenness and lostness as people, as men and women who have fallen short of the glory of God, who can only be fixed by God himself, loving us, saving us, and transforming us for his name's sake. To make a more contemporary example, imagine tattooing John 3:16 on your forehead. in reverse because you want to look at it in the mirror, all right, and be able to read it. Would that make you more right in the eyes of God? Just the bare fact that you got a permanent, you did something permanent to your body. Does that commend you to God in any way? And I'm not saying you can't do that and be a Christian. I don't recommend it. I don't think it makes you not a Christian or a Christian to have tattoos in any kind of way. But does the bare fact of getting a tattoo actually do anything spiritually? No. And just as fruitless would be trying to keep all of the Old Testament commandments or any other commandments you come up with in order to earn God's favor. You see, it's as pointless to get that tattoo as it would be to try and keep all the commandments of God. Those are being equivocated here. It's just as fruitless. It's just as much a lost cause. It's just as foolish to think you can keep all the commandments as it would be to think tattooing something on yourself would make you right with him. There's only ever been one requirement in response to God's holiness, his promise, his love, his perfection, his judgment, his mercy. The only thing that we can do is have faith. Or as the reformers put it, sola fide, faith alone. Not faith and circumcision, faith and works, or as they said in Acts 15, faith and keeping all of the commandments. Notice how they just slipped it in. It wasn't just about circumcision. It was about all of the Mosaic law. How easily, once you add one thing to sola fide, you add everything. Not faith in being a Jew, not faith in belonging to the right church, not faith in having the right politics. Sola fide, faith alone. That was what was at stake. Genesis 15:6, after God had given him, reiterated to him that promise and that covenant, one of the most profound statements in the Bible, it's reiterated several times. Genesis 15:6, the text says, and he, that is Abraham, believed Yahweh, and he counted it to him as righteousness. This is the continuity between the Old and the New Testament. This is the continuity between Jew and Gentile. It's so profound. You understand, for faith or belief to be counted as righteousness is the only way you're going to get through today in the eyes of a holy God. Because this is God's choice to say, instead of needing your perfection, your holiness, your perfect righteousness, every second and microsecond, that not once today will you ever have a bad thought, a bad motivation, a bad word on your tongue, which I've already screwed this up today, right? Most of us probably have. Instead of requiring that, what God says, you know what I will take instead is you believing in me. That is a tremendous statement by the God of heaven to say that belief I will count, faith I will consider, reckon as righteousness. It's almost like an accounting failure of God. Wait. You're saying, again, making crude analogies here, you're saying that if I believe in you, you're going to cancel a debt of $100 million. That is a huge failure of your accounting department in heaven. It'd be like that. No, that's the reality of it. That's how profound it is, because it's not just that you owe $100 million to God, right? The consequences of sin is death and judgment, wrath, and fury forever. But God, he will consider faith as righteousness. And Abraham, in that moment, he was believing all that God had said in his promise. Circumcision was a signpost pointing to something, God's promise. As Revelation later unfolds, we have Moses introducing the idea of a sacrificial system with animals and a priesthood in a tabernacle, and these also were pointing to something. The 10 Commandments are given, and all these laws about justice and mercy are offered, and everything is intended to point to something, not that you need to keep this law. No, that you can't, but God is holy. That you need a way to be right with him, not dependent upon your works, but upon the sacrifice. That you need a mediator between you and God. This priest is going to stand between you and God. All of these things were pointing ahead. And as history unfolded, God revealed more and more of his word, more pictures, more signposts of what ultimately we are to have faith in. And that is God himself coming to us as a man, Jesus Christ. That everything the Jews had and were exposed to and knew was always pointing to Jesus, even circumcision. Colossians 2, 11 through 14. Colossians 2:11 says, "In him also," that is Christ, "you were circumcised with a circumcision made without hands, by putting off the body of the flesh, by the circumcision of Christ, having been buried with him in baptism, in which you were also raised with him through faith in the powerful working of God, who raised him from the dead. And you who were dead in your trespasses and the uncircumcision of your flesh, God made alive together with him, having forgiven us all our trespasses, by canceling the record of debt that stood against us with its legal demands. This he set aside, nailing it to the cross." The New Testament reveals that Jesus is the fulfillment of every promise and covenant and commandment and picture. He is the true Israel. He is the once-for-all sacrifice. He is the actual presence of God among men. He is the physical descendant of David and legitimate king of the world. He alone is the mediator between God and sinners. He is the Word made flesh. In him solely is all the fullness of deity in bodily form. He is matchless. He stands alone. As the reformers put it, solus Christus, Christ alone. Sola fide, faith alone. Solus Christus, Christ alone. To add anything to needing Christ alone is to diminish Christ and to make him lesser. Think, if I gave you a parachute and said, this is all you need to survive jumping out of this plane, I would be making the claim that this parachute is sufficient for your successful journey to the ground. But if I said, all you need is this parachute, but then I said, you know what, no, take this umbrella, take this life preserver, take this pack of gum, I would be diminishing the claim that all you need is the parachute, right? You start thinking, wait a second, I thought you said all I need is a parachute. Why are you giving me all of this extra stuff? Anything I would add on top of the parachute, in addition to the parachute, takes away from the idea that the parachute is all you need. And that's again, another crude example. But imagine now if I told you all you need is faith in Christ to be saved. Sola fide, solus Christus. But then I said, but also don't forget to be circumcised. And also don't forget the Mosaic commandments. You need to keep those too. I necessarily, by adding things, I subtract from Christ. I diminish the claim of solus Christus and sola fide by any other thing I add in addition. That's what's at stake there in Acts 15. It wasn't just about the Gentiles joining the party and Jews being slightly racist against them. That might have been part of it. But it spoke to the very essence of our human nature to add to what God has done. Because when you add to what God has done, you get to add your own pride. You get to add your own contribution. See, if it's Christ and circumcision, or Christ and keeping the law, well, now I get to boast. I'm pretty good at keeping the Mosaic law. I think, yeah, we're all Christians here, but when I became a Christian, I also. You see, to add to Christ is to take away from him, and so often it's to add to ourselves what is the glory or for the glory of God alone. No, may it never be. This is the problem. In Acts 15, this threat that comes by way of these, they're called Judaizers, but those who would say, these Gentiles, you need to add circumcision. And how quickly they said, not only circumcision, but they also need to be ordered to keep the whole law of Moses. It's backwards thinking. It's not just backwards thinking to go back to that. It's contrary to even what the Mosaic law said, because the Mosaic law also said, you need to circumcise your hearts, and God needs to do that. It's actually to ignore the revelation of God and add man, insert man, which diminishes sola fide, solus Christus. It's only ever been, from beginning to end, you are saved by grace through faith in Christ. At the time, they didn't know who Christ was, but they knew circumcision. Circumcision was pointing to Christ. They didn't know Christ, but they had the sacrificial system. And they believed that by faith, if we offer these sacrifices, God will receive it. It was always faith in Christ. That did not change from Old Testament to New. There's always continuity there. And that was the threat. And if they got that wrong, at that critical moment, the whole church would have collapsed. The gospel would have been lost. And man, like at Babel, would have erected a name to himself in the place of the church and in place of grace. It wouldn't have been solus fide or solus Christus. It'd be solus anthropos, solus man. No. If there's anything I've learned about man, is we're not all that great. Anna, can you hand me my phone real fast? This reminded me of a quote. This morning, John Wilcoxon's sister texted me this morning just to thank us for everything everybody did here. And she said, I wanted to tell you yesterday after the service that among John's copious notes was a quote from someone that said, "Don't be humble, you're not that great." I mean, it just, kind of capped, don't be humble. You're not that great. Like that fake humility, like, thanks for telling me my sermon's okay. I think, you know me, just thanks for listening. And, my head's like, yeah, that was okay. All right? Don't be humble. You're not that great. If I know anything about man, we're not that great. Only God is. That's what's at stake here in the early church. That's why we need to care about circumcision, because it wasn't about circumcision. It was about any appeal to our own works, our own self, to commend us to God, rather than faith in him. And so, they get it right. Spoiler alert, they get it right. We'll talk about that more next time, but hopefully today you have a better idea of why this was such a big deal to them and why it's such a big deal to us. If you're not a Christian this morning, it's probably more than you wanted to hear or know about circumcision, and yet it's critical because it says something about all of our conditions. Man or woman, circumcised or not, that's not the point. It's all of us fall short of the glory of God. All of us sinned. All of us need a salvation outside of ourselves. Circumcision, if you appeal to that for your salvation, you're pointing to yourself to save you. And this is also what I know about people. They're not very good at saving themselves. You need a Savior from your sins, the one who can forgive them, the one who sent his Son to die for them. You need faith alone in Christ alone. If you are a Christian this morning, let us be thankful that we have entered into this promise and hope of God, that he accepts us not on the basis of works we have done, but upon the finished work of Christ.